How are you, Paul?
Good, thanks.
And of course, Dr. Jim Salem. Now, you've been busy continuing to fight the freedom fight over in Canada.
That's right, yes.
And there's a lot of fighting to be done. I'll tell you something, Paul. I read a very interesting statistic. 33% of Canadians now die by assisted suicide. And complementary to that figure is a national poll in Canada shows that 28% of Canadians agree with assisted suicide for the homeless. What's going on there? It seems to be that Trudeau is leading the absolute vanguard for the World Economic Forum and the
yes. There's been a general cheapening of life. One of the key beliefs of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party is the absolute right to have an abortion. In fact, he won't allow anybody to run as a Liberal candidate if they are pro-life. So it's absolute straitjacket, ideological straitjacket. So on the opening part of life is ignored and cheapened, and at the end, although they won't quite say they're useless eaters, but that's the Liberals have been very, very eager to push through this assisted suicide, or I guess medical assisted suicide. And I saw that in operation with the mother of a friend of mine out in British Columbia. She was fairly easily influenced, and she had some bad medical setbacks, and she was well into her 90s. But she was persuaded that it would be very, very easy. You can have your loved ones around you as you go. You can choose the time of your going. It's painless. You just kind of drift off to sleep, and then I think they give them an injection in the heart. But okay, granted, it may indeed be not terribly painful. But I saw the way she was manipulated. In fact, when she indicated she might be open to that, a doctor arrived, and we called him Dr. Death. And he was positively bubbling about how easy it would be, and she wouldn't have to suffer anymore, or feel depressed, or so on and so on. And in the end, despite the children did not know she was going to do this. Well, sorry, they did not approve. When they found out, they strongly urged her to back off. Well, she did for a bit, but then she got persuaded again, and in the end, committed suicide, or medically assisted suicide, I guess they'd say. And and I bounced this off several people in the medical profession, and they said, well, these people are consuming resources and so on. They're not going to get substantially better. Their life is just about over. So why not check out? And it was absolutely cold-blooded, a matter of saving. And I thought, but you don't say that about bringing in hordes of third world immigrants, all of which will massively consume, medical.
In terms of liberal doctrine, Paul, what liberals claim to believe in, that every human life is sacred, that we must wage wars for human life, that to take a single life is to injure all of humanity, and so on. From your point of view as a long-term commentator on these matters, what do you think it says about liberal doctrine? Is it a division between the pseudo-humanitarian aspect of doctrine and then the economically utile aspect? What is it that drives liberals?
Well, I think the two overlap, Dr. Salim, and there's a great deal of hypocrisy. During the COVID craziness, they were not at all worried about hurting human life, forcing people to choose between a medical procedure, namely the vaccine that many people had big doubts about or were afraid of, or I know people who have been badly damaged by vaccines earlier in their lives, and they were forced to either um, endure tremendous calumny and abuse and isolation, or else give in. So the liberals' great concern about human life is fairly one-sided, and they greatly value the life of a repeat violent criminal over the life of an unborn child. There's been a big debate because there have been so many acts of violence and stabbings on our subways and in Toronto and Vancouver. There's been a real outcry against our catch and release um, uh, policies, except for political people. Political people who've not committed a violent act have a great deal of trouble getting bail if they've been charged under some aspects of the criminal code. But violent criminals, they're caught, they're released. The cops deal with them again. They're caught, they're released. In fact, there's the notorious 20 individuals in Vancouver in 1 year had 7,000 charges against them. In other words, the police would arrest them this morning for stabbing somebody or pounding somebody. They take them down to the police station. They'd charge them. They go before a judge, and very likely they'd be back on the street by late afternoon and do it again. But the liberals are very, very concerned that, well, if we really had strict bail conditions for repeat violent offenders, well, this would unduly impact the so-called indigenous population, that's Indians, and vulnerable minorities, that's blacks. Well, there's a good reason for that. They commit crime wildly out of proportion to their share of the population. But because the liberals are so fixated on numbers, well, they are, there's a larger percentage of the prison population that are black or Native Indian than their share of the general population. There must be something wrong. Well, there is. They commit a lot of crime, but the liberals would say there must be systemic racism.
Do you think? I suppose you probably do. The French theorist Alain de Benoit used to say that there's an inherent totalitarian subculture written into liberalism. Would you agree with that thesis?
Oh, yes. We see this all the time. For all the feel-good chatter and the constant reassurance that they want to keep us safe, they want to protect us. There's a very, very totalitarian aspect. That last year, because of large public protests that were nonviolent, absolutely nonviolent, the Trudeau government brought in the equivalent of the old War Measures Act. It was called the Emergencies Act, and to smash the truckers' protest. It allowed them to freeze the bank accounts of anybody that they deemed to be involved. This could be, in one case, a mother in Chilliwack, British Columbia, a single mom, had given $50 to the truckers' convoy. Her bank account was frozen. She wasn't a leader. She was just a very small supporter. And it allowed them to arrest people, to suspend all sorts of liberties. So their great concern about human rights only applies to certain people. And I've seen a really mean totalitarian spirit. Maybe it was there before COVID, but during and since COVID, last Saturday, there was a rally of people who'd been involved in the truckers' convoy in a community near me. It's Oakville, Ontario, and it was held in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire. Now, Canadian Tire is a chain of stores that originally started in the 20s with auto supplies, but now sells general hardware and household cleaning and things like that. Anyway, there was a great deal of chatter on the internet that the Canadian Tire should not allow that. And in fact, at one point, it sounded as though they would not allow the use of their parking lot for this. But on the evening of the event, about 300 of us gathered, some with pickup trucks, some in cars, with flags and banners, and just a generally good time. People were talking to each other. Some people were dancing. Anyway, the outrage, absolute outrage on the internet among the woke and the leftists that they should boycott Canadian Tire, that this should not be permitted. This hate gathering, any opposition to them is always labeled as hate. In fact, they even said, and there was somebody carrying the red ensign. That was me.
Yeah, congratulations.
Oh my God, that. Hey, I might just as well have been Anton LaVey. But they were, and the idea that because they didn't like it, it ought to be banned or stopped. And because Canadian Tire didn't ban it, or actually they didn't do anything. I think a couple of employees came out to ask, well, people are not going to come into the store. They're, protests, and it was pointed out to them, no, this is outdoors. We don't have anything to do with with the store, and that was fine. So it was a live and let live, which is the way it ought to be. And but now Canadian Tire's management has groveled and said, this would not be permitted in the future, and they do not support the goals of the. I wonder if they even know what the goals are of the truckers. No. And does that okay? Flip it around. Does that mean they don't believe in freedom? Businesses are so cowardly.
So initially, these convoys, etc., were in response to the draconian lockdown measures. They seem to have morphed into a general statement about freedom, etc., freedom in general. And I have to say, from hearing about the situation there, you seem to be the northern part of what's happening in America, because we're seeing exactly the same situations. Criminals running rampant to be released onto the streets. The unfettered abuse of power by the Liberal establishment. And I believe your commentaries on it are so unwelcome that you've been banned from Twitter, along with Tom Sunic, Kevin McDonald, James Edwards, and I don't know who else. So there's a few points there, but I will ask you, how were you notified about your banning from Twitter?
This happened on April 24th for the four individuals you mentioned, also for the American Freedom Party, which is a racialist populist party, and we believe others, but those are the five people or organizations we know about, all on the same day. And we received a little notification from Twitter: your account has been suspended indefinitely for violation of Twitter rules. And if you think this is in error, click this and appeal. Well, you're given about a quarter of an inch of space to appeal. And well, the problem is, how do you appeal if you don't know what you allegedly did? And I've appealed 3 times, and I received one acknowledgement that we've received your appeal, but I've received no answer to my question. What was it I did? I mean, I can't really argue if I don't know what it was that was said that caused somebody's feathers to go all ruffled. I don't think it was anything I said or Dr. Tom Sunick said or Dr. Kevin McDonald or James Edwards. I think there was a hit list given, and you guys are on the hit list. Now, what we're trying to do is to find out, is this a rogue employee or somebody lower down in the pecking order, or does this actually come from Elon Musk? Because Musk has repeatedly made very strong statements about freedom. He continues to make these statements. I'm not so naive as to think that important people don't lie from time to time. But I mean, he's really made this pretty much a calling card. So I retained a lawyer in Los Angeles. I was very lucky. This man is quite well connected. And what we're trying to do is to get higher up in the chain of command, or to their legal department, and maybe even to Musk himself, if that's possible, and say, "Oh, look, this is what you do, or what was done by your company. We want our accounts back." And at the very same time, Musk was making very fierce statements about legislation that had been introduced in Ireland. There will be just a complete squelching of free speech. I don't have the details, but he was outspoken about it.
Yeah, well, the moderation is clearly not being even-handed, because everything you posted, or everything that, because Australia First subscribed to all your accounts, and everything was measured, and yet there's accounts out there, let's say, simpatico to our cause, that are much more unbridled, which and yet they're not receiving any sort of anything outside of the occasional penalty, which does, of course, lead to speculation that this has been a list.
It's a hit list.
Yeah, and Musk has, or either, as you say, is not aware of it. But I fail to see, for a man that has obviously been looking over the shoulder of what's going on there in regards to freedom, that that this can be passing without him being aware in some degree. Have you been in touch with any of the other proscribed criminals?
Yes. I did a show with Dr. Tom Sunick, Dr. Kevin McDonald, on James Edwards' Political Cesspool show. So four of us spent an hour kicking this around. I mean, I don't mean to be completely cynical. It is possible, with all the irons in the fire Musk has with his car company and various his space program, he may not be aware of the nitty gritty, and that's why we made this approach, because I mean, it gets out on the internet, the apparent hypocrisy. I think he said there would be complete free speech unless it violates the law. Like, I mean, I can't write a tweet saying assassinate the head of Antifa or something like that. Obviously, but
Well, in recent times, I've read particular emails that you forwarded regarding Justin Trudeau's now new immigration program for Canada, with 500,000 migrants per year. Do you think there's any linkage that your opposition and the opposition of other patriotic Canadians might have sparked something at Twitter?
Well, in my own case, without being too vain about it, I am seeing some of the arguments that we have put out over the last decade, well, in some cases even longer, popping up in mainstream commentary by mainstream writers, not particularly right wing or populist. Now, they may have come to these ideas on their own. I don't claim a copyright on these, but for instance, linking our collapsing medical system, Medicare system, to the vast increase in the population. I mean, they're not expanding the number of doctors or hospitals or nurses in tandem with the hordes coming in. I mean, I would say that's so obvious. I shouldn't be able to.
Well,
Says not copyright.
to just take that point one step further about the migrant list that's now engulfing your country. Australia did something very similar only a few weeks ago and announced that there'll be something like 900,000 plus people arriving in all categories of visa into Australia over the next 2 years.
1.5 million.
Yeah, that's right. There's other figures too. And obviously, this is a massive surge in numbers: overseas students, contract labourers, temporary visas, across all categories, possibly including part-time workers, doing little seasonal jobs. It's the whole box and dice of it. Over 90% of that will be non-European persons. I think these two things are linked together, and obviously the presence of some of our politicians and yours at the Bilderberg Summit and other places where these people meet and discuss. How intense do you believe the Trudeau program of migration will be into Canada in the next few years?
Well, he's absolutely committed to that. But I do find it interesting that there is now beginning to be mainstream media criticism of the numbers. Up until almost yesterday, to criticize the numbers, let alone the makeup, you could be easily slapped down or silenced by "you're a racist." That's not as effective anymore. So there's, of course, the health problem. There's also chronic homelessness and housing problems. We don't have housing for a variety of reasons for our own people. So how are we going to house another 500,000 every year? I mean, they're not going to live down by the creek. They're not going to burrow under the snow up in the Arctic. They don't even go up there. But so where are they going to live? I mean, this is, as Sherlock Holmes said, elementary, dear Watson. I mean, come on. But up until very recently, I didn't hear a thing about that, except from the publication we put out and all the tweets and the website, and maybe a few other people like Immigration Watch Canada in Vancouver, but mainstream, virtually nothing. Now I'm hearing those comments, and am I seen as an influencer? I don't know, but we do put the ideas out there, and I think you're right that there is some sort of a game plan, probably hatched by the white haters at the World Economic Forum. We've got to up the immigration numbers. We've got to up them up fast before opposition can really gel. And I think that's what's happening.
Well, as you'd remember, once it was during the time of Tony Blair's stewardship in the UK, there was actually an admission that immigration was being used as a political tool to actually break community resistance to the idea of immigration, make immigration so large, so absolute that no one could possibly challenge it on any grounds. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do, and I think that's perhaps an explanation for why the tremendous haste. We're always lied to about. We've got a labor shortage. We've got and the baby boomers are retiring or will soon be retired. Where are we going to get the workers? Well, the children and grandchildren of the baby boomers. That's where you'll get them. And maybe if they weren't so wild about encouraging abortion, we'd have more of our own young people coming up. But the labor shortage is largely nonsense. We've got in Canada right now about 5.5% unemployment. It's not all rocket science jobs that are going. What a lot of businesses want is cheap labor. Yeah. I'm a free enterpriser, but I am increasingly cynical about much of the business establishment. They have. I read a lot of corporate reports, and They almost without exception, they have swallowed lock, stock, and barrel uh, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I part of me said, well, okay, they pay lip service to anything, but they won't do anything. But they are doing things. They're actively.
Well,
Uh,
it's something they've agreed upon at the World Economic Forum. There's a name for it which escapes me, but it is it is an agreed to corporate principle around social conscience and environmentalism, etc. It does have a name. I used it in an
the name is ESG,
yeah.
environment, social responsibility, and good and governance.
Yeah,
That's it, ESG.
Yeah,
And part of this social social responsibility is this equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I point out to people, don't confuse equity with equality. We may agree that people should have an equal chance. In other words, if you get an education and you're qualified, you should have an equal chance to get a job. Equity means equal results. So they say, well, we're a little shy on the number of blacks and Native Indians and one-eyed people, purple people eaters on our staff right now. So we've got to hire more of those preferentially. So we get the numbers up. They have bought into an ideology that is as crazy and dangerous as Lysenkoism was in the time of Joseph Stalin.
Well, you can seriously see Klaus Schwab in it, and it has an absolute communist flavor to it. What with its concept of internationalism without nationhood or national sovereignty.
That's actually.
I'll tell you something. The word inclusivity, they don't use it anymore. No, they've changed it to belonging.
That's interesting. Belonging,
so their manipulation of speech to their ends has changed.
It was put to me by someone with some economic knowledge that we actually live in a type of diarchy now, that when the claim is made by globalist modeled economists that we have a labour shortage, that we must adjust the price of labour, we must have things more competitive and so on. In one sense, well, here's the point. If you were a globalist managing a global economic order for global outcomes, they're actually quite right. You must. The only question is, should that be the model in the first instance? Of course, there's clashes on the global model between available workers and other workers. But if you're looking at economic rational outcomes, from their point of view, they're totally correct. Of course, that must be so. You must cheapen labour in order to make certain things occur. You must break down certain barriers to have certain things happen. It's a quite rational process. The only problem is it's completely wrong. And I think that's where perhaps the opposition should come from, should it not? That we have to look at a different model of global governance. We have to look at different trade patterns. Countries have to trade for mutual advantage. They shouldn't have to trade on level playing fields where everyone appears to do the same thing. That would be quite pointless. It would be as stupid that perhaps countries export the same products to each other. That would make no sense. We end up in a globo world, and that's the model. A Canadian has to drink Australian wine. An Australian has to drink Canadian beer. Well, actually, we don't, except perhaps in a very limited way. Everything has to be leveled down, ground down. The globalists are correct, but only by the globalist model. And past that point, they are not correct at all.
I agree with you. I think that's a very important point. Several times in our conversation, the comparison is being made to communism. And I don't like to oversell the product, but I think that's absolutely true, but not in the old Marxist economic sense. No. Very, very, very few people believe in Marxist economics. But some of the other things that went on under communism, for instance, the punishment of dissent, the favoritism of the criminal. I didn't realize that till I read Solzhenitsyn. Up until maybe the mid 80s, I would have agreed with the statement. Boy, one thing you can say about the Russians or the communists, they don't tolerate crime in the Soviet Union. They'd run your sorry ass into prison for stealing 1 kopeck. That turned out not to be true, because the communists saw the criminals as, I think what Solzhenitsyn said, was a sympathetic class. Not exactly that they were persecuted, but well, they need to be sympathized with. So as long as they committed their crimes against ordinary citizens, that was okay. And actually it was useful, because if you were afraid that you might be mugged or raped or assaulted in some way, going out on a Moscow night to some forbidden political meeting, that was actually a good thing to scare people. So the criminals, were treated relatively lightly. Now, the people that weren't treated lightly were political dissidents, and that's what we're seeing here in our society. Look at the ferocious penalties that were imposed on people who participated in the protests on January 6th in the American Capitol. Very few of those people involved themselves in violence, but their mere presence was enough to merit the charges, and of course, for
that's a good example to raise, because they cancelled, like they cancelled all of you guys off Twitter at the one time. They have cancelled Tucker Carlson, who was absolutely acting as a pair of very sharp scissors and cutting through that whole fake narrative that everybody knew was fake. But he had the smoking gun with that video of the so-called January 6th shaman who was imprisoned and loaded up with all these charges. And the video showed him being escorted through there with by guards and acting peacefully. And it became, and of course he's since been released. But what I want to ask you, Paul, is, at least in the illusion of democracy in America, they've got Donald Trump, they've got DeSantis, and they've even on the Democratic side got Robert Kennedy as a potential theoretical antidote to the excesses. What have you got in Canada, and how long is that Trudeau idiot going to be entrenched there?
Well, he heads a minority government. The Liberal Party did not win a majority of seats. So as I think in the Australian lower house, if you don't have a majority of seats, you have to form a coalition or risk every vote possibly being a confidence vote, and you could lose and an election would follow. So they made a deal. The Trudeau's Liberals have made a deal with the Socialist New Democratic Party, headed by a real Canadian, Jagmeet Singh. We call him Dogmeat. Jagmeet Singh. Or sometimes I call him Turban Guy. He wears a tremendous a variety of turbans in the House of Commons.
Very stylish.
And very, very chic. He, before he was elected to the federal parliament, he was somewhat briefly in the provincial parliament in Ontario, and he was voted by GQ, the gentleman's formally, one of the best dressed men of the year. He has these many $1,000 suits and so on. Kind of, I don't know, contradictory for a man who says he's a socialist. One of the intelligence agencies I have a fair deal of respect for is Indian intelligence, from the subcontinent, not native Indians. And India will not allow him back into India. They say he has such close ties with Sikh separatists and terrorists that he's persona non grata. But he has quite a following in the left liberal press that are very impressed with him. He's a sanctimonious person.
Well, it's actually just an aside before we get on with business. The Prime Minister of India is coming to Australia, I think, next week. And there's a very large stadium in Western Sydney, I understand, that's been booked for the meeting. And it could be tens and tens of thousands of people, Indian backgrounded people who are turning up there. We have a famous suburb in Sydney called Parramatta. You may have heard of it. It was one of the very early colonial settlements famous for agriculture. It's now actually a majority Indian suburb, and they erected a statue to Mahatma Gandhi in a park there. It's taken on an entire new provenance, and it's not to be surprised at. I assume that your Mr. Singh has the same ideas on migration, I would assume.
Oh, yes. He's never met a third world immigrant, legal or illegal, that he didn't like.
Charitable.
In Canada, the Indian community tends to be quite divided. The Sikhs are a very, very large component. We have the largest Sikh population outside of India. And many of the Sikhs don't like Prime Minister Modi because he's a nationalist. The Hindus are relatively small. They like Modi. And the Muslims, there are a lot of Muslims from India. I'm not sure quite where they stand, but certainly the Sikhs are antagonistic. So if you've got a large Sikh population in Sydney, there might be some fireworks at the.
Well, there is one in Melbourne, and there were wild scenes, I think, late last year at the City Square area of Melbourne, where Sikhs began an attack on Hindu backgrounded Indians. And it's been incredibly common in Melbourne. This tension is there. In fact, in the Parramatta area too, there's been a lot of tension between some Muslims who may not always be of Indian background, but some Muslims, and the Hindu community. And this has now become a commonplace in Australian ethnic politics. In fact, I have a particular question for you in a moment about ethnic politics that might stretch your recall and whatnot. But this has now become a very common thing here. I take it that ethnic violence in Canada amongst migrant groups is now a regular thing?
Well, it does occur. Don't know about regular, but there have been a number of attacks on Hindu temples and even a few individuals. And of course, the press would dearly love to pin it on white supremacists, but the Hindus said it was Sikhs, the radical Sikhs. It wasn't white people.
A few years ago, sorry, Paul, I must just cut in on you there. A few years ago now, I actually had a call from an Indian journalist in Calcutta, and he was phoning regarding ethnic violence in Australia, where Hindus had been attacked by gangs. Hindu students and whatnot from India that had their laptops stolen, money, wallets, credit cards. And I said to this fellow, I said, yes, I said, but I have to say something to you. I said, these attacks that are taking place are not taking place by people who look like me. I said, this is simply not right. And I said, if you phone the commissioners of police in Sydney and Melbourne, bluff them. Tell them that you know that they're multiracial gangs of people who may be of Middle Eastern or Pacific Islander background. Is this true? What's the incidence of it? Several days later, I got a call back from the same journalist, and he said, look, I have to thank you very much for this. He said, it turns out that you were right. These were the identities of the gangs. He said, but in India, it was being advertised as white people, Australian backgrounded people who were carrying out these attacks. So the media wasn't being very, let's just say, accurate up to that point. But Indian media reported what was said extremely widely. I assume you have the same. You might have the same situation in Canada. I don't know. Do these attacks on these people take place from perhaps Native American backgrounded people? Who's responsible?
I don't know if this directly answers the question, but we had a kind of rather horrific incident about 6 weeks ago in Vancouver in a Starbucks coffee shop one Sunday afternoon. A white guy in his 30s with his redheaded little daughter were drinking coffee with some other woman, and a Sikh sat down near them and was vaping. And the white father asked him if he'd move elsewhere or stop vaping because his daughter had respiratory problems. Well, they talked back and forth, and the Sikh got up and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. And this all got caught on people's cell phone cameras. And you see the fellow prostrate on the floor, bleeding out. There's a pool of blood, and people were walking by, taking pictures. Nobody came to his assistance initially.
Yeah.
That was seemed to be the big scandal. Well, okay, that was what was reported in our lamestream media. But a friend of mine who reads the Indian media, like from in India, said, "Well, look at what the Hindustani Times said. The Sikh who stabbed this fellow was had been at a number of radical Khalistani or Sikh separatist rallies in Toronto, including protesting against a visit by Prime Minister Modi. But the local press was either too ignorant or lazy or just suppressed that information. And the question I asked, and even the Indian media, as far as I could tell, didn't know, what did he use? I mean, most of us don't carry a dagger, but many Sikhs do. They have the kirpan, which they're legally allowed to carry in most places in Canada. You and I would not be allowed to carry a concealed switchblade or weapon, but they are. That's equality. Special rights for them, fewer rights for whites. But I thought was an important question, but not answered. But however he did it, the Sikh happened to have a knife near at hand and stabbed the guy to death.
I'd like to ask you another question, if I can. I foreshadowed this with a discussion I did last night. The political use of some communities that may be present in Canada. I understand that Canada has a large population of people who are of Ukrainian descent.
Yes.
Right. Well, we have a lot of Ukrainians, traditionally backgrounded people, migrated after the Second World War, and they've always been very, very good people, very, very good people. And no objection could be made to them on that basis. But we've witnessed in Australia a very, very cynical, let's say, program to politicise these people in a particular direction because of the unfortunate war between Russia and the state of Ukraine. In other words, to perhaps use people who may, in one way, a homeland connected to them in some way gets devastated in war, regardless of why it is or how it is. They become a volatile group of people. Is there any indication to you that even sometimes European migrants in Canada could be manipulated or misused by security or media or government programs to arrive at other results? Is this a possibility in Canada? Is it happening?
Yes, there's a large Ukrainian population in Canada. Some came before or just after the First World War. Many came after the Second World War. And the globalists have just, to a man, backed the Ukrainian, this corrupt Jewish prime minister's President Zelensky. And I think we both know the reason. He was tasked to prepare the Ukraine to join the European Union, but you'd have to bring in things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. He allowed in a fair number of third worlders who would not be popular in Eastern Europe.
No.
And then for reasons that maybe beyond what we can talk about tonight, there was this conflict with Russia. Well, to me, the sane route would have been to say, look, you guys, and bash their heads together. You've got to work out a peace. There's got to be peace. This killing is terrible. It's terrible for the Ukrainians. It's terrible for the Russians. But our government, of course, in lockstep with most of the United States and France and Britain and Germany, has backed the Ukrainians. And this has been very popular with the Ukrainian community, which very often tended to be conservative. They're being used for a political reason. And it's obvious through all sorts of establishment things that support for the Ukraine is now part of what any good globalists must do. You're collecting money at some of the banks for Ukrainians. Whenever you see on Twitter a Ukrainian flag beside a name, most of the time those people will be very hostile to the things you and all three of us believe.
Yeah, it's probably something you know from the history of Australian migration, but and quite understandably so. People who left Europe, who were from the Baltic states, they couldn't go. They felt return to the Soviet Union. It was an impossibility. Many people came to Australia. It's one of the great ironies that as people, they were some of the best people a country could ever receive. But in the 1950s, the politics of it was so manipulated into anti-communism that when the Liberal Party decided to dismantle our old so-called white Australia policy that you know of, these people were virtually for it to a man. And the issue in their mind was fighting communism. Therefore, Taiwan was their friend, South Korea was their friend, and so on and so forth. There could be no restriction on migration because this got in the way of anti-communist politics. And this, I've actually had it, I won't name the person, but a very senior person in one of those backgrounds came to the conclusion that this was wrong and that whatever injustices were done to the country that she came from couldn't be counteracted by doing an injustice to Australia. And but she said to me, this lady, that if I ever told the truth, that would be the end of me as a person here. I couldn't function. So the manipulation of communities isn't new here. Is there manipulation of European migrant communities to Canada going back over decades as well, or is this only an Australian thing?
No, I think you're right. And I remember as we began to be aware of what had been done in the 1960s, the same as happened with the ending of the White Australia policy and the throwing open of the doors in the United States in 1965 with the so-called Immigration Reform Act. As in the 70s, as we began to be aware of what was being done to us, although on a much lesser scale than today, I would hear voices from East Europeans and Germans. It wouldn't be right to oppose immigration because that used to be what white Anglo-Saxons did, who didn't want people like them in our country. They were initially somewhat neutralized as opponents to immigration. Later, as the numbers became obvious in big cities, many of them let their common sense over. Yeah, I mean, black crime and gangs and so on. That changed.
Sorry, I'll just finish what I was going to say. I'm actually told that myself and other people who've been active nationalists for a long time, we're actually still very unpopular, extremely so, amongst some of the very old people who come from particular backgrounds, because we made it clear more than 40 years ago that for our country, the issue was not communism. The issue was Australia's placement next to Asia and the necessity of restricting migration from the third world. And a lot of these people were involved with third world groups on the issue of communism and the old USSR and so on. And they all did virtually to a man Australia an enormous disservice. And so this rift was always there. And I notice again, some of the very old ones and some of their descendants are now all very active in pushing Australia's involvement in the criminal war in Ukraine. And I find that quite irksome. I find it extremely irksome. As you said, the goal must be for peace. The goal must be to bring the powers to some sort of bargaining arrangement. None of them before that. They're all supporters of the war, carrying on of the war.
I've lost a few friendships over this, but I'm really wedded to the notion of no more fratricidal wars. Did we learn nothing from World War I and World War II? What did it accomplish? What did they accomplish? Just the massacre of tens of thousands of the best and brightest of our people. We lost genetically. We took a tremendous hit in those wars, and doesn't matter whether it's the Anzacs or the Canadian troops or the French or the British or the Germans or the Russians. We all, to one extent or another, lost a tremendous number of people, but also many good people. A man who died just recently is a very good friend of mine, Dr. Roger Pearson, and he edited, okay. And part of his worldview was shaped by what happened in World War II. His older brother joined the RAF, and I don't know, he lasted a few weeks or a few months, but he died in the Battle of Britain. And the average lifespan of a pilot in the Battle of Britain, a fighter pilot, was something like 6 weeks. And to be a pilot, you had to be quite intelligent, healthy, strong, and bright. So you kill off these people. Not to say that any white life isn't valuable, but you could be an infantryman and not perhaps hang back and you peel potatoes and you don't actually see much combat. You don't have to be very bright. But the type of people who were in these positions in the air forces of all the combatants, and then in the First World War early on, we were so crazy that the troops would go over the top, being led by an officer, sometimes not even carrying a weapon, carrying a swagger stick or a handgun, and with suitable markings that marked him off as an officer. Well, of course, what happened to these people? Well, a machine gun, and they're dead. And these were to be an officer, you probably had to be a little bit brighter than other people. I've had a theory for about 30 years that the reason since World War II Canada has been led by really second-rate people, with maybe one or two exceptions, is that the best and the brightest, most of them, died in the First World War and didn't reproduce, and therefore their offspring, by the time they hit leadership roles in the 60s and 70s and so on, that contributed to the fact that we were led by real second raters.
Well, there's a thing that I've remarked, that the Australian military in the First World War had three great achievements: Anzac, the charge at Beersheba, and the mutiny on the Western Front. And that was backed up at home by the defeat of the conscription referendum, which you probably heard about. Australia voted down military conscription, which was an incredible thing in the middle of a war. But we did. I know you guys didn't have anything like that in Canada. And the slogan was, oppose conscription, save white Australia. And that was organised by a man who later became Australia's great wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin. A marvellous achievement, and very true, very right. I've got one question for you, Paul, which I think is very apposite. I know our time is running out. You may be aware from different sources that Australia is having a vote later on in the year for a Aboriginal voice to the Parliament. And I'm happy to say there are many Aboriginal voices who have come out against this referendum and say that it's never going to change anything on the ground. It's simply a mechanism by which certain privileged people amongst us get access to Parliament and to money and other things like that. It's never going to assist us. Would you have any comment on Canadian law, which perhaps in this case has not actually advantaged Canadian Indians? How's it worked?
Well, there is now an official ideology promoted by Trudeau, the Liberal Party, and much of the intelligentsia and academia and the media that we treated the Native people shamefully. We tried to genocide them. I mean, they latch onto these outrageous accusations. There was no genocide here. The attempt to, at one point, to try to promote assimilation wasn't the same thing as genocide. Genocide, you take the people out and you shoot them or you starve them to death. You get rid of them. That's genocide. But this has created an absolute industry in Canada of preference for natives. In our justice system, we have what's called the native discount. And this was decreed by the Supreme Court some years ago in the situation of sentencing. The judge has to take into account the native background of the offender. So if he was born on a reservation, he is deemed to have been a victim of racism, colonialism, and God knows what all else. The result that many of these offenders go back, they get a light sentence or very diminished sentence, and they go back and commit crime. And most of the crime is against their own people.
I was going to say that.
And then these handouts that are being given as compensation. If you spent even one day in a residential school, that was worth, I think it was $25,000. And then you got another, I believe it was $3,000 for every year you spent in. So if you were in there for 9 years, that was, something approaching $50,000. No questions asked. Now, if you can allege that there was you being somehow abused, well, there'd be a little hearing, informal hearing, and you might get a lot more. Well, there's a tremendous, influx of free cash. It didn't do the Indian people any good. In fact, I was told that in places near large Indian reservations, like I'm thinking of the Habima reservation to the south of Edmonton in Alberta, the local merchants selling car dealers or selling snowmobiles or other sexy toys were just rubbing their hands with glee because the Indians, flush with their newfound windfall, would come in and blow it, and some months later the vehicle would be a wreck. And so, how much better off are the Indians?
Is this question related to a Indian? What is your bloody word for Indians over there? What do they call themselves? Are they just ubiquitously called Indians, or?
Oh no, it's like American. It's like American blacks. Their name changes every few years.
Okay.
Currently now they're either First Nations or Indigenous people. Prior to that, they were Aboriginals. But yeah, I always wonder about a group that can't agree on its name, or maybe the names that are.
Well, it's only recent in Australia that our Aboriginal people have been rechristened First Nations, which is United Nations propaganda.
This is interesting because we've got a current debate. It's not even a debate. You did. You mentioned that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And sorry.
No, Jim, it's your show. Right?
I was going to ask, just to take this thing to the next step. Has there been any situation in Canada where the Canadian Indian community has been, shall we say, abused to advantage by foreign corporations or other corporations seeking control over resources or obtaining access to their communities in a way that actually really does cause them suffering or disadvantage?
I think so, but I don't have specific examples. If you're talking about mining or logging, both the provinces and the federal government have so many strict rules and permits that have to be gotten that require uh, uh, Indian people as assent and so on. I'm not sure. I just can't be sure about that.
There is a concern here that of a dilution of actual sovereignty. And if this voice succeeds, it actually opens up parts of Australia to different patterns of investment or so forth, that it won't actually serve any real interest. Let's say for Aborigines, it doesn't serve them if something they think they possess is suddenly recolonised by a foreign corporation, that sort of thing. But obviously, as you're saying, there's nothing quite like that in Canada. So,
right.
Well, I don't know. Our host has stepped off site for a moment. I've run through my list of questions for you tonight, and I suppose it comes back to you if there's any matter you wish to raise that you think is of interest to our Australian viewers.
Well, with each passing day, I think it's more important to stress race and our future. We are being replaced, and although the mainstream media will, self-interested politicians will mock the Great Replacement as a conspiracy, a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's happening. It's right before your eyes. It's a reality. And the same as hurricanes and typhoons are not a conspiracy theory. If you've ever lived through one, it's real. That's what's happening. We are being replaced. I don't know in Australia the exact D-Day, but if we don't massively reduce third world immigration, the European founding settler people of Canada will be a minority in the land we built shortly before 2050. In the United States, it's will be around 2041 or before. I mean, we're not talking about the obscure, the remote, far distant future. We're talking, just a few decades at best, and we'll be replaced. And we will. And what's really bad is we'll be replaced, having our treacherous leadership having taught the newcomers that we're rotters, we're bad people. I mean, we genocided the native people supposedly, and we wouldn't let the Jews in during the Second World War, and the whole long list of crimes. I think the newcomers, far from being grateful, will feel that they have got the right to lord it over us, as their numbers will let them do, and they will have had the moral justification, not just might is right, but they've been told that we weren't very good people anyway. And the sad thing is there are many white people in Canada and the United States who buy into that. They've been so brainwashed. So teaching white pride, I think, is an incredibly important thing, because we're not going to reassert white power until we have a substantial number of people who feel white pride or European pride, or however you want to call it.
Thank you. To our host.
Is that okay?
Thank you.
Now, Paul, we never got closure on the question I asked regarding when you guys are going to get the hell rid of Trudeau.
I'm sorry. That kind of drifted off. Yeah. If he retains the support of the Socialist New Democratic Party, he doesn't have to call an election until 2025. So we have him for another 2 years. But there might be a falling out. And if there is, the opposition could force an election, or if Trudeau senses opportunity, he might dissolve Parliament and force an election. We will. The latest we can have another crack at him is 2025.
Gee, what's his popularity like?
Well, his popularity now is lower than that of the Conservative Party leader, the official opposition. He's lost a lot of support. Part of it is just time. You know, he was elected in 2015. After a while, any politician becomes a little bit stale. And he's been subject to scandal after scandal that because of the immorality of the Liberal Party, it doesn't seem to matter. Even if he's caught red-handed with an ethics in an ethics violation, oh well, so what? Just goes, life goes on. But that accumulates, and there's a great deal of anger against Trudeau for what he did during COVID. The population is very divided. Some people think all these restrictions were necessary, and anybody who objected wanted to kill grandma or was socially irresponsible or whatever. That's one point of view, and they have no time or no tolerance for people who disagree. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who were awakened by the brutality of the state and the loss of their liberties, and so we do have a fair deal to work with.
Okay, listen, thanks very much for talking to us, for affording us your time, and we wish you all the best. We hope to catch up again soon and find out how it's all going.
Yeah, I'm very glad to do this anytime you want.
Okay.
Well, good night, Paul, or good morning, whichever way you want to take it, or good afternoon, whichever way you want to take it. Thank you.